Hey everybody, it's Charlie. Warner Brothers just screened the Joker movie for critics, so I had a chance to see it early. We're allowed to post our non-spoilery reviews and reactions, so we'll try to explain as much as possible about the movie, why everyone's going crazy about it, why critics seem to love it so much, and why it will change DC movies, or certain kinds of DC movies, forever. It's sort of a watershed moment, the same way that Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight trilogy was a watershed moment. No joke, you have to go see this movie. Even if you're not a huge fan of the Joker character, you're not a big comic book fan, it is a very important moment in superhero cinema, and I will explain because technically it's not so much a superhero film as it is a really deep character study and meditation on a single character. We'll do a giveaway for movie tickets. All you have to do to enter is be a subscriber and leave your favorite Joker moment from the comics or from any of the previous movies so far on this video. You've probably been reading a bunch of interviews with Todd Phillips the past couple of weeks talking about how this is definitely not meant to be a superhero film the way you would traditionally think of a comic book DC superhero film like Justice League, Batman v Superman, Aquaman, the Wonder Woman movies, even the Harley Quinn Birds of Prey movie, which just dropped a little trailer, which I'll be doing a video for later today. You have all this stuff around the Joker, you've seen him in all these other films, but this film is meant to be so different from the way they make those other films. If you're a big fan of Martin Scorsese and you've seen any of the Joker trailers, you're probably getting serious Travis Bickle Taxi Driver vibes from Joaquin Phoenix's Joker, and the director was very clear that he was inspired by a bunch of different really classic films. This will actually get you a little more excited. The 1928 classic film The Man Who Laughs, which is also partially inspiration for the comic book origin of the Joker, Scorsese's Taxi Driver, of course, The King of Comedy, which you've also seen a lot of references to in the trailers so far, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. Joaquin Phoenix said that he wanted his performance to not be easily identifiable or classifiable by any kind of psychiatrist or mental health professional. He said that he didn't want his version of the Joker, which is named Arthur Fleck within the world of this movie, which is also another departure from the comics, which I'll talk about in a second too. But he said he wanted to create something totally new, free from any sort of pre-existing continuity. It's not meant to be tied to Justice League, the DCEU films. They're calling it DC Black Label, or at least Todd Phillips, the director, is calling it DC Black Label. He told this amazing story about how long it took him to convince DC and Warner Brothers to let him make a movie like this with a character this big. One of the earlier conversations he said that he had with them was them telling him, "You realize that we sell Joker pajamas at Target. Kids are running around in Joker pajamas, and you want to make this crazy Taxi Driver R-rated hardcore meditation on the character." It took a full year of Todd Phillips grinding them down, convincing them before they would say yes to it. So this film has been in the works for way longer than you might have thought. This was all happening while things were going really crazy in and around the Justice League premiere, and we were finding out about all the things happening behind the scenes. Those bigger, more commercial DC films, the DC universe, however you want to think about it, went through their own reinvention in that period, going off in a much brighter direction than previously seemed like they were going. So the way they're talking about this new Joker film is that it's the beginning of what you would call DC Black Label in the same vein as their comic book DC Black Label. If you're not a big comic book reader, what DC did is just to sort of build on the idea of the DC brand, because everybody knows DC Comics. When you see DC Comics on a comic book, that's meant to be their mainstream titles like Batman, Superman, Justice League, Wonder Woman, Green Lantern Corps. Any kid could walk into a comic book shop or wherever comic books are sold and read one of those, enjoy it, have fun, have a really cool story, but it's also a little bit more mature. They call it Teen Plus, so like an edgier version of something that would be okay for a 13-year-old, but also okay for someone who's 18, 19, or even older and has been reading the character for the last 20 or 30 years. The new DC Black Label is meant to fill the gap that the Vertigo brand used to. Very adult stories, not meant for kids, just really hardcore stuff like the Boys series on Amazon you may have seen recently everyone was going crazy about. That originally started as a Vertigo title. It's so crazy that there's no way that DC Comics would ever put their name on it, but for a little while, DC was publishing that comic book underneath their Vertigo brand. So that's why you have this new movie, DC Black Label, where you want to make this really cool, hardcore, R-rated Joker film, but you can't really put DC's name on it, so to speak, because DC and Warner Brothers want your average family to see the DC name on stuff and know that it's okay for families. It's sort of a Disney brand type of issue, so that's where DC Black Label comes in. So if the Joker movie is as successful with audiences as it is with critics, and they decide to embrace the idea of the DC Black Label movie, they put a slightly different title and intro sequence on it so that anybody that brushes by a poster or a trailer or sees a clip knows exactly what the tone is and who it's intended for. Like, oh, this is a really cool film about this character, but I probably shouldn't take my kids to this. If you do happen to have children and you just took them to see Avengers Infinity War, obviously this is way more hardcore. If you feel like you could show them Taxi Driver and they could understand it or they wouldn't be traumatized by it too much, then you could probably take them to the Joker movie, because it very much is Taxi Driver with the Joker, if Martin Scorsese was making a superhero comic book film. Joaquin Phoenix's performance is amazing, but I think part of the reason why the movie works so well is because Todd Phillips sort of freed himself from the idea that he was trying to tie this in with any kind of pre-existing continuity and wasn't trying to reference any of the other iterations of the Joker that came before. Like, we all talk about Heath Ledger's Dark Knight Joker as being one of the best performances of that character. Mark Hamill's Joker on Batman the Animated Series, one of the best Jokers of all time. This is meant to be something completely different from that. Joaquin Phoenix didn't go back and watch any of those other films. He wanted something to be completely unique, so you could look at him and not be confused when you see some other version of the Joker in one of the other Batman movies. So you may be disappointed if you were looking for this to tie in with the other larger DC universe. Like, you're not going to see Joaquin Phoenix show up in Matt Reeves' Batman film, even though I'm sure there's going to be a ton of videos trying to tie this film to that film. It is a very big departure on the origin story that you know from the comics, and there are technically 3 versions of the Joker because, as part of the new comic book DC Black Label, Jeff Johns is doing a comic book called The 3 Jokers. That's just the comic book way to try to explain how there are so many different versions of the Joker's origin story, because up to this point in the comics, he had no definitive origin story. That was kind of the point of the character. He's been this wonderful engine of chaos for so many years, driving all these Batman stories, but various times you'll have different writers come on and write a slightly different version of the origin story. Most people are probably familiar with the Red Hood version of the Joker origin story, or say like the Tim Burton origin story where he falls into the vat of acid in Ace Chemicals. I feel like it's not a spoiler to say that there's no version of that kind of comic book origin story in this movie. It's a very Taxi Driver descent into madness origin story. It's meant to be 70s Gotham, like 70s New York, before it got cleaned up, before the Disneyfication of Times Square, when you couldn't walk through Times Square without walking by one of the peep shows. This version of Gotham is just meant to be the darkest timeline version of New York City in the 70s. The film also does a lot of commentary on the way mental illness is treated and perceived in modern society through a lot of these characters around the Joker character, or Arthur Fleck, before he becomes and embraces the Joker persona. Like, you see him talking to the psychiatrist during the last big trailer, and he feels like she doesn't listen to him. You have no idea what's going on with me. All of my thoughts are dark thoughts. So I think a lot of you will probably go into the film understanding that even though he might see himself as the protagonist of his own story, this is a movie where there are no real heroes, so to speak, unless you count a very young version of Bruce Wayne that will someday maybe become Batman, because everything that happens in this film is very different than what you've seen in previous Batman origin stories, so be free to speculate about what might happen if they do more sequels. Todd Phillips hasn't been talking too much about doing direct sequels to this movie, but I'm sure they would come back to the table. He's mostly been talking about the advent of DC Black Label films. So what he might do instead of doing a direct Joker sequel, if this film is really successful, is just do the same thing with another DC character, either a villain or a hero. It doesn't necessarily have to be a villain. Part of the reason why Todd Phillips was able to get this film greenlit is because he only spent $55 million making it. Most of the smaller, what you would consider DC movies like Shazam, are $90 million, by example, and that's because they have a lot of special effects, a much bigger cast. This film doesn't have any of that, so this is a drop in the bucket compared to what they spend on the traditional big DC level films, like the Wonder Woman sequel, Wonder Woman 1984, probably spent over $150 million making that movie. So if they do more DC Black Label films, it would be smaller, lower budget films like this, so there are only certain characters for which that would work. So you might be able to do a Lex Luthor origin story before Superman arrives in Metropolis. You might be able to do a Deathstroke movie, like there's the Joe Manganiello Deathstroke movie that they were originally going to make, which now seems like it's never going to happen. But maybe they could rewrite that film to be like the Joker DC Black Label film. Deep character study on who Deathstroke is and why he does the things he does, how he became Deathstroke. This is also the same reason why they were so quick to greenlight the Birds of Prey movie, because Harley Quinn as a character and those other characters, even though they do have a lot of weapons and there's more characters in the film, doesn't require really big crazy effects like a Superman movie does or even a Wonder Woman movie. But everybody let me know in the comments if they do more R-rated DC Black Label films for villains or maybe even for heroes, which characters do you want them to do? There was a brand new Birds of Prey trailer that they secretly dropped in front of the Spider-Man Far From Home re-release that was disguised as a trailer for the It movie, but then suddenly changes to a Birds of Prey trailer. I'll do a video for that next that should be up later tonight, early tomorrow morning. Everybody click here to rewatch that last big Joker trailer, and click here for my video of all the brand new deleted scenes that they added in.